Asian leaders are racing to strike a deal with the U.S. as they warn of the negative impact of President Trump's reciprocal tariffs. White House officials say more than 50 nations have begun negotiations to avert additional levies on their exports to the U.S. But one of America's biggest Asian allies, Japan, is remaining cautious. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba warns that the results would not come overnight. He says the government needs to prepare other measures to cushion the blow, including funding local firms and supporting employment. Japan's export-reliant economy is expected to reel from the U.S.'s 24% reciprocal tariffs and 25% levies on autos. For a closer look at the impact of these tariffs, let's speak to Shandre Thangavelu, head of the Jeffrey Cheah Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University. Professor, thank you for making the time to speak with us. Stock markets across the region opened sharply lower today, extending a global sell-off. Help us understand why the Asia-Pacific region is seeing such a significant and negative impact on the stock market as a result of Mr. Trump's tariffs.
Thank you, Ronnie. Let me state very clearly that ASEAN and East Asia has the most open economy in the world. They have the lowest level of tariffs. And with our free trade agreement, multilateral agreements, and even the bilateral agreements, we have reduced the tariff rate to a very, very low level. So fairly, the measure that's been used by U.S. Actually it's put the East ASEAN countries and especially ASEAN at a disadvantage. The way they use the deficit to the imports from U.S. itself. So there's not much of a leverage for us to negotiate. Either you reduce the deficit or you increase the U.S. imports into our respective ASEAN member countries. But when you look at the actual tariff rate, as already been discussed, it's very much lower. And fairly, there's a lot of political economy used in the measure. Maybe one measure they might have considered is how close ASEAN and East Asia to China trade and the China global value chain activities itself. So fairly, ASEAN need to respond to this in terms of how we're going to manage the US and also the China and our regional trade agreement and trade integration itself.
You mentioned that ASEAN needs to respond to this. Malaysia's prime minister is pushing for a coordinated response. How exactly could this work, especially given that different member states are facing different tariff rates? Is a unified response then the best way forward?
It is, because ASEAN centrality is the center for most of our trading arrangement and trading bloc itself. If ASEAN centrality breaks down, then a lot of other free trade agreements and other dimensions will also be called into question. So ASEAN centrality is very key for us to move this forward. For example, under the Trump reciprocal tariff, EU is given as a bloc to negotiate at 20% tariff rate. But when you look at EU itself, within EU, there are countries with respective deficit with the US itself. So fairly, if the Trump administration is willing to give European Union as a bloc to negotiate at a 20% rate, then fairly ASEAN as a bloc should be able to negotiate at least at a 20% or even lower rate. That it becomes important because the trade diversion effects are going to take place from this high level of tariff that imposed on ASEAN LDCs like Cambodia, and Laos and Myanmar, and emerging countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia. It seems to be quite unfair. So the fairly coming from a bloc point of view and from a coalition point of view, you're able to discuss many other issues other than cutting tariff. Cutting tariff is only one dimension of what we are talking about in terms of trade. The other dimensions are involved. Intellectual property right, dispute settlements, many other issues will come about because this game that Trump has started is a repeated game. So countries that are rushing into this will end up in the corner solution, which means they have to give more by themselves than as a coalition itself. So fairly countries that already have existing FTAs will use their existing FTAs to negotiate because that is a legally binding agreement. So countries that are not in an FTA have to come with a bloc to actually discuss. If Trump administration is willing to give European Union as a bloc, then they should also give ASEAN as a bloc to negotiate and bring it down as much as possible. because that itself is important to include other dimensions in this discussion, including dispute settlement, including IP, and many other issues. Including rules of origin.
How optimistic are you that we could see the U.S. lower tariffs or even scrap them altogether?
I don't think so. The game they started is not to scrap because they have a baseline of 10%. So they're putting 10% across, including trade surplus countries themselves, including Singapore. Singapore has a big trade surplus to them, but they also have been hit by 10%, which is quite unfair because then the issue is trying to raise down to the baseline of 10% becomes important. But the next question is deficit, US deficit doesn't come down, then Trump is going to increase at 10% to 20%. So countries going in blindly and try negotiating without a proper strategy becomes, you will push right to the corner solution, and it creates a lot of other issues. The issues are what you call the MFN principle. The MFN principle by WTO agreements, if you give one member a zero tariff rate, for example, to US, you have to give to all other members a zero tariff rate, which actually means that it's not a viable option in terms of looking at how your economy is going to grow. Trade must translate to growth and industrial transformation. That you're going to give up itself. So how are they going to negotiate this by themselves? It's going to be very difficult with the US itself, because the countries are scrambling to actually talk to the US, all the small open economies, because to avoid the trade diversion effects.
You mentioned that countries are scrambling with their negotiations with the U.S., which also could take quite some time to come to some sort of a deal. So then what are the chances that more countries will start announcing retaliatory tariffs? And what kind of impact would that have on the region?
Okay. So from a trade negotiation point, there is a source country effect and the host country effect. So initially what we're seeing is the host country is scrambling and running to make sure there's no trade diversion. But there's also a host country effect. The host country effect is against US. So what are the host country effects? The stock market is on a crash, not only today, but the last 3 days. Trillions of dollars has been lost and pushing US to a brink of a recession, which is very likely if you push this. So his negotiation point is getting weaker over time. So whereas we scrambling to negotiate with him, it's with Trump himself, it's to the disadvantage of the host country. So countries like Japan, Indonesia, Singapore standing back and say, let's see how it works out, because the dynamics is also against US. Because the sooner US settles this tariff issue, the better is for the economy. Then yes, good news. But if we actually delay this, which is very likely to be, because this negotiation is going to take not a month, it's going to take 6 months or longer, it's not to the benefit of the US. So his negotiation point become weaker over time because the stock market and the domestic issues are actually escalating against him. So that is again a negotiation point. That's how we do trade negotiation itself, looking at the source country effect and the host country effect. So at this time, I will say there are advantages for us to go as a coalition and to work this out in a structured manner so that we can actually include this. So what the Prime Minister, Anwar, the Malaysian Prime Minister, is doing is the right thing. As an ASEAN coalition, we need to bring this down to below 20% and closer to maybe 15% or even to 10% itself in a proper structured way to discuss other issues. The other issues are rules of origin. If I can cut the tariff, then people are going to use low countries to actually penetrate the US market. So that's the next iteration they're going to do. And then they're going to increase the baseline to 20%. So without a proper structure to actually discuss this negotiation, countries are scrambling now for individual discussion. They will be in a very dire strait. That's the reason why we need a global trading rules itself, so that we can have a proper way to protect developing countries and less developed countries to participate in this trade itself.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your insights with us. That was Shandre Thangavelu, head of the Jeffrey Cheah Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University.